So it's my great pleasure to open this lecture at the Gregorian University. Welcome to the Gregorian University. I'm Father Etienne Veteux. I'm the director of the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies of this Pontifical University. And this greeting is in the name of the two co-organizers of this series of conferences, yesterday and today. So the Angelicum Thomistic Institute and of the St. Thomas University, just 5 minutes away from here, uphill, and the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies of the Gregorian University. Welcome to those who have joined us this evening. So His Excellency Ambassador Schutz from Israel. You can't hear me? Ah. Mi sentite? Okay. Also happy to greet Father Norbert Hoffmann from the... He knew I was going to introduce him, so he... That was not the best timing, but... So Father Hoffmann, in absentia, is the secretary of the Commission for the Religious Relations with the Jews of the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity in the Vatican. So the title of the conference, of the lecture this evening, is A Catholic and a Jewish Perspective on the Land Promise and its Contemporary Significance. Why this theme? Why the theme of the land, of the promise of the land? Rabbi Rosen, who I'll introduce in a few minutes, often says, I've heard him say at least twice in the past years, that speaking with Pope Benedict before, well, Cardinal Ratzinger at that time, Cardinal Ratzinger told him that everything that is holy for you or that has a religious importance for you is holy for us Catholics. This has a religious significance for us Catholics. And Rabbi Rosen was quick to point out that the land is holy. So there are many ways of understanding this, but there is this deep bond to the land for, in different ways, but a deep bond for every member of the Jewish people. But often in Jewish-Christian relations, this is the elephant in the room, as some say. One of the thorniest themes, the most difficult themes, maybe dangerous themes, complicated themes. It's a theme that the Catholic Church has a difficulty in confronting for a few reasons that will certainly be evoked this afternoon. There was a step forward on a diplomatic level in 93, 94 with the recognition of the State of Israel on a diplomatic level. But on a theological level, most of the statements of the Catholic Church are very cautious. I'm going to quote just one that may be quoted again this afternoon, also from the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews in the 1985 note on the correct way to present Jews and Judaism in preaching and catechesis in the Roman Catholic Church. The document says that Catholics should not make their own any particular religious interpretation of the relationship to the land of Israel. They should not make their own any religious interpretation. But at the same time, the Catholic Church has moved forward in these past decades to the point of saying that the gifts and the promises of God to the Jewish people are irrevocable. And the promise of the land is part of these promises. So how do we understand this? And this is not only a question for Jewish-Christian dialogue, it's also an inner question for the Catholic Church and for all Christians, because the land promise is very present in the Christian Old Testament. So in a certain way, this is one of these occasions in which dialogue helps one of the partners rediscover its own tradition. Or at least confront our own tradition. So I'm happy to greet the two lecturers of this evening. We'll start with Rabbi Rosen. Rabbi Rosen, former chief rabbi of Ireland. He's the Jerusalem-based international director of interreligious affairs of the AJC, the American Jewish Committee. He's a member of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel's Committee for the Interreligious Dialogue. He's the international president of the World Conference on Religion and Peace. He's also honorary president of the of ICHKIC. Do people know what that is? The International Council of Christian and Jews. And the only Jewish member, if I'm not mistaken, of the King Abdullah International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue, established in 2012 by the King of Saudi Arabia, together with Austria, Spain, and the Holy See. In 2005, Pope Benedict bestowed upon Rabbi Rosen a papal knighthood, which means that, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi David, you are the highest ranking Catholic in this room.
Prove my enemies right.
It's the best way to bring you on our side. Okay, and also he was awarded a Commander of the British Empire award by Queen Elizabeth II for his interfaith work, and many other distinctions which I will not present this evening. Rabbi Rosen, the floor is yours. Yes.
It's on now. I am very honored to have been requested to give this presentation, but I confess, and I need to confess to you all, in a good Catholic institution, that I am a poor substitute for the man who was meant to have spoken this evening, as the senior representative, if you like, of the Jewish delegation, Rabbi Professor David Novak, who, due to the pandemic, is not able to be with us, and therefore, with your permission, I send him from here appreciation for his contribution to this conference and best wishes for good health and a healthy future ahead. I have had the honor to already present today to our seminar on the bond between the Jewish people, the biblical, rabbinic, and contemporary Jewish attachment to the land of Israel. So inevitably there's going to be a little bit of repetition. I will try to cast some slightly different angles in addressing this particular subject of Jewish perspective on the land promise and its contemporary significance. While the book of Deuteronomy describes the divine election of Israel as a testimony of God's love and his fidelity to his promise to the patriarchs, and through Exodus 19, alludes to Israel's role in this regard in its reference to a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, the very idea of special election still begs the question of why or what for. To use Jacques Maritain's language, not only is Israel a mystery, but, quote, Israel remains a mystery to itself. The prophet Isaiah seeks to explain the purpose, in effect elaborating on the above terms in Exodus 19, with the words, quote, "You are my witnesses, says the Lord, my servant whom I have chosen, and I have given you as a covenanted people to be a light unto the nations." Israel's election has the universal purpose of bringing the illuminating awareness of the divine presence to the world. And Israel testifies to this precisely through its own history. For Isaiah, this not only explains the idea of divine election, but also the conundrum of why Israel seems to suffer so much and seems to be so hated in the world. Israel is God's servant who suffers from the sins of others. Isaiah's idea is that if you have been selected, whether you deserve it or not, even whether you live up to it or not, to testify to godliness and goodliness in the world, then everything that cannot tolerate that godliness or that godliness will find you intolerable. As a result, the sins of the world are directed at you. You are assaulted by them. This idea of being God's suffering servant, taking on the sins of the world, is not one of vicarious atonement, but indeed as target and testimony. For Isaiah, it would have been obvious that Nazism would seek to exterminate the Jews. Nothing could have embodied the hostility to the biblical message more than that ideology. Maurice Samuel, the 20th century writer and man of letters, lays this out powerfully in his little book, The Great Hatred, which incidentally Maritain described as the unintended but most impressive Christian formula concerning the spiritual essence of anti-Semitism presented for us by a Jewish writer. It is in such a light that Isaiah presents Israel's suffering, let alone her deliverance therefrom, as testifying to the divine presence in history. The prophet Hosea's treatment of the mystery of election is deeply moving and insightful, and I believe takes us a little further in understanding the nature of this covenant. Based on his personal relationship with his wife Gomer, he saw his own experience as a reflection of God's interaction with Israel. Gomer seemed to be incapable of remaining truly faithful to him. And her profligacy, of course, causes Hosea profound distress. She sinks lower and lower until she becomes a slave concubine of another. And yet, despite it all, when she is abused and rejected, Hosea provides for her without her even being aware of it. Eventually, he buys her back from slavery, brings her back to her marital home, and seeks to rehabilitate her and reestablish their relationship. Hosea began to see this as all symbolic of God's relationship with Israel. God similarly has taken an enslaved people and redeemed them and blessed them with his love, with a national home and protection. But this people was all too often disloyal to its marriage vows, as it were, and with ingratitude forsook the one Lord for false gods. The consequences of this led to much suffering. But even in that suffering, God provides for Israel. And God's dealings with his people are not only on the basis of justice, but above all with unlimited mercy and love. He similarly takes back his unfaithful bride and facilitates her rehabilitation in her home of destiny. In the words of Umberto Cassuto, quote, Israel's kingdom might fall and all its outward structure may totter into ruin, but Israel will live because of the infinite love of God. Accordingly, even in its unfaithfulness, Israel testifies to God's unlimited love and forgiveness, let alone when Israel lives faithfully in keeping with the commitments of her betrothal. Indeed, the very survival of Israel defies historic materialistic categorization. Historians who refuse to view Jewish history in any spiritual sense are constrained or even frustrated into using forced epithets to describe Jewry, such as Arnold Toynbee, who described the Jewish people as a fossil of history. But other Christian observers have also seen the very survival of the Jewish people, and indeed the persistence of anti-Semitism as well, precisely in an original biblical sense of testimony. Jacques Maritain was one of the most powerful in his articulation of this idea. Another was Walker Percy, who described Israel as a positive, quote, sign in the modern age that cannot be encompassed by theory. The fact that Israel remains throughout the changes of history and exile reveals not Israel, but the paths of God, he wrote, and suggested that contemporary secular anti-Semitism comes from the fact that the very existence of the Jews highlights postmodern science's inability to explain all things neatly. Quote, the Jews are a stumbling block, Percy declared, that cannot be subsumed under any social or political theory. However, beyond the mystery of covenant itself is the question of why the land is central to it. It is presented in the Bible as part and parcel, if not the focus of the divine covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of the divine promise to the children of Israel at the Exodus and ratified at Sinai. However, this still begs the question, if the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, as Psalm 24 declares, And if there is nowhere where one can escape from the Lord, for as Psalm 137 says, if I go up to the heavens, you are there, or if I make my bed in the depths, you are there, then we can ask, why on earth, literally, why on earth, is it necessary to select any particular location on the planet at all? The Torah is not explicit about the role of the land, but it is implicit. To be a holy nation, this holiness must be evidenced in all aspects of national life. If the people of Israel is to testify precisely through its national identity to the divine presence in history, then this must inexorably relate, for better or worse, to the fate of their homeland. This bond not only remains inextricable, but it is part and parcel of the people's divine destiny and métier. Accordingly, the Hebrew Bible is categorical in declaring not only that the punishment for Israel's failure to live in accordance with the commandments is exile from the land, but that notwithstanding the tragedy of exile, its pain and loss, God's faithfulness to his promise is eternal, and he will return them again to the land of their forefathers, demonstrating his unique fidelity. And Hosea's imagery gives us an even deeper appreciation of how, even in its exile and humiliation, Israel has testified to God's love, forgiveness, and the constant expectation of Israel's return to him, and as a result, to the land. Even after the destruction of the temple, the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Hadrianic persecutions, and the various exiles, a Jewish presence remained constantly in the land, even though under early medieval Christian rule, Jews were limited and not allowed to live in Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, Jews continued to pray to return to Jerusalem, as well as in grace after every meal. The Passover meal ends with a prayer next year in Jerusalem, as does the service of the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the Jewish year. At all weddings, a glass is broken, as tradition affirms, to remember the loss of Jerusalem and the temple that cast a pall for Jews even on the most joyous occasions. The famous Spanish rabbi mystic Nachmanides of the 12th century argued, based on earlier rabbinic statements, that the precepts of the Torah, the commandments, were only applicable to Jews living in the land of Israel, and that in the diaspora these obligations are only required in preparation for returning to live in the land. Jews like Nachmanides himself did return to settle whenever the opportunity presented itself. Most notably after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, the Ottoman Empire welcomed them, and Safed in Israel became the main center of Jewish spiritual life. Throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, Jewish individuals and groups were continually returning to the land from all over the diaspora whenever they could. Only economic, political, or security reasons stood in the way, and these were, of course, substantial. The move to translate this into a more systematic action increased in the 19th century, not least of all due to the greater possibilities for travel, but above all galvanized by the experience of persecution in the lands of exile. Great rabbinic personalities were prominent in this activity. Notables like Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer of Thorn, now Torun, in Prussia, Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai of Sarajevo, Rabbi Shmuel Mohileva of Vilna, now Vilnius, were all seen by the Zionist movement as its forerunners. In 1884, 34 delegates met in Katowice and elected Rabbi Mohileva president and the secular Leon Pinsker as chairman of the organization they named Chovevei Zion, Lovers of Zion. The failure of modern ideologies to improve the lot of the Jew led to the increasing attraction and support of secular Jews for the Jewish national idea. Representing a wide spectrum of social and economic ideologies from Marxism to nationalism and liberal capitalism, they progressively assumed a dominance. In 1897, these various and competing movements coalesced under the leadership of an assimilated Jew, Theodor Herzl, into the Zionist movement. In 1903, the British government offered this movement the possibility of establishing a national home in Uganda. To be precise, the territory offered was in the Mao Escarpment in modern Kenya. Theodor Herzl thought that this would be a solution to provide a refuge for Jews suffering from persecution in Europe, even if only a temporary one. At the Zionist convention that year, he brought this proposal to the delegates, but he was shocked to hear the boos and noes coming from the audience. In response, he was especially taken aback by the opposition of the Jews from Kishinev, now Chisinau in Moldova, who had recently experienced a brutal pogrom. But for the vast majority of the Zionist movement, whether religious or secular, the aspiration was not just to find a refuge, but to return specifically to the land of promise, the land of their ancestors. There was, of course, opposition to this movement, not only from assimilationists, but also from within orthodoxy, especially ultra-orthodoxy, both in terms of whether it was correct to establish a Jewish polity in the land before the Messianic Advent, and above all, precisely because what was envisaged by the vast majority of the movement's leaders and followers was not under any circumstances a theocracy, but a secular democracy. However, pursuant to the Shoah, the Holocaust, these voices became more muted, and today the centrality of Israel to Jewish life is acknowledged by the overwhelming majority of committed Jews, both in the state and in the diaspora. As already mentioned, the idea of divine covenant and the promise of the land, and accordingly the re-establishment of independent Jewish life in the land, does not assume that Israel will automatically behave according to the high standards demanded by the covenant. On the contrary. But precisely as the Hebrew prophets declare, in its failures as well as in its successes, Israel testifies to God's unlimited love, patience, and forgiveness. Just as Ecclesiastes states that there is no righteous man on earth who does only good and does not sin, so there is no nation that is without failure and blame. Modern Israel has made remarkable strides and stunning achievements in so many fields of industry, science, arts, and innovation, while it has absorbed a wounded and beleaguered people from around the world of its dispersion with an amazing degree of success. It has succeeded in establishing and maintaining a democracy, albeit imperfect, despite the fact that the vast majority of its citizens did not live in or come from democratic societies, and it has done all this under conditions, economic, military, and social, that could have torn a mature democracy into smithereens. And yet, for all these miraculous achievements, it continues to fall short in many ways. And surely the most serious of these failures result from the absence of a permanent resolution of the conflict with the Palestinians that would enable all the peoples who live in the land to live with full dignity and flourish. The Zionist movement had hoped to establish an independent Jewish state living in peace with its Arab neighbors. In 1919, the World Zionist Organization chairman, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, signed a joint declaration with the Emir Faisal, the son of the Sheriff of Mecca, leader of the Arab nationalist movement, to establish a pan-Arab state across the Middle East, in which the two welcomed each other's movements and pledged mutual cooperation. This, however, was not to be. The victors in World War I, who began dividing up the spoils of conquest, had made too many promises to too many people and were incapable of delivering on all of them. As a result, territory became, if you like, a salami, sliced into different pieces, leading to a great deal of resentment, competition, and one of the victims of that was the relationship between Israel and the Arabs, and specifically Israel and Palestinians. Amongst Israel's most notable battles was the Six-Day War, when Israel was stunningly delivered from an attempt to annihilate her. As a result of her victory, she took over control of the West Bank from Jordan and Gaza from Egypt. Even though in exchange for peace, Sinai was returned to Egypt and certain territories returned to Jordan, Israel's continued administration of the territories and the Palestinian population that it still controls leads, perhaps inexorably, to an amount of conduct and treatment that are not compatible with Jewish ethical teaching. As is well known, there is much debate in Israel as to what is the best response to this challenge, with many, perhaps a majority, believing for the time being, there is no capable Palestinian partner to enable Israel to extricate itself from this situation. In parenthesis, just for the interest of anyone who may be curious, this is not my personal opinion. There is no shortage of parties to share for the blame of this situation, including, of course, Israel itself. But one wonders whether any society would have done better under the circumstances. Nevertheless, the ongoing conflict not only causes suffering for Palestinians, it has also taken its toll on Israeli society. It is not just the human price of conflict and of death and the absence of the physical benefits of peace, but an inevitable ethical erosion that seeps into society in many ways and places. And for as long as there is no resolution to the conflict, this, unfortunately, will only increase as time goes on. However, the message expounded so beautifully by Hosea is that to be in a covenantal relationship does not in itself guarantee good behavior. It does not even guarantee success. Israel may well fail and fall, and it deserves to be criticized when this happens. But none of its mistakes and misconduct ever sever that covenantal bond that mysteriously binds the people to God and is inextricably related to the land itself. On the contrary, even in the people's failures, there is testimony to divine fidelity, patience, forgiveness, and love. In 1993, I had a private audience with Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II, when attending the prayer for peace in the Balkans held in Assisi. It was by no means my first meeting with him, but it was my longest conversation with him. In receiving my colleague Lisa Palmieri-Billig, who is with us, and me, he reformulated the message of Nostra Aetate with phrases he had used previously in relation to the Jewish people. You know, he said to us, I have said that you are the people of the original covenant, never abrogated and never to be abrogated. For those for whom the covenant between God and the people of Israel is something to religiously affirm, and especially for a church whose magisterium teaches that this biblical covenant endures forever, it is difficult to see, let alone understand, how the religious significance of the bond between the people and the land can be ignored. Classical Zionist thought envisaged what it called a withering of the diaspora, as a more authentic expression of Jewish national life re-emerged in the land. Although this did not happen as much, let alone as quickly as such thinkers envisaged, the degree to which diaspora communities and identities are dependent upon Israel today in so many ways is striking. Despite the fact that I personally do not identify with secular classical Zionist thought, I have my own serious doubts as to whether diaspora Jewry can survive in the long term, other than in some isolated small pockets, without the existence of the State of Israel. Moreover, it seems to me that it becomes morally problematic to maintain a separate religious, ethnic, communal identity outside a national context when living in free democratic societies today. These realities, for me, highlight the significance of the land promise for Jewry's posterity and testimony. However, above all, for many, if not most Jews, the State of Israel reflects what a modern scholar has described as the Jewish people's very quest for authenticity. As a religious Jew, privileged to live in modern Israel, while at the same time deeply and continuously troubled by the moral dilemmas it faces and poses, I am conscious daily of that divine love notwithstanding that has been vouchsafed to us throughout our history and consummated in resurrected Jewish life in the land, maintaining its mysterious covenantal significance for the Jewish people and ultimately for humanity at large. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Rabbi David, for having covered so much ground, biblical, historical, political. Thank you also for having been, let's say, honest and candid, both presenting what you call the miraculous dimensions of the land, well, the ingathering of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, the modern ingathering and the state of Israel, but also what you call the risk of ethical erosion in the conflict with the Palestinians. So I think this will give us a lot of food, not only for thought, but also for discussion afterwards. But I will immediately give the floor to our next speaker, Professor Gavin DaCosta, who is also the main co-organizer of this series of conferences. Thank you, Gavin, for being here. Professor DaCosta is a professor of Catholic theology at the University of Bristol in the UK, and he right now holds the Aquinas Chair at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is why he is in Rome, and we're using this opportunity. Professor DaCosta was born in Kenya. His parents are from India, but he then moved to the UK and completed his doctorate at Cambridge University. He's the author of quite a good number of books that have been translated in also quite a few languages. And he is advisor of the Roman Catholic bishops in England and Wales on matters related to other religions, and has worked at the World Council of Churches and also at the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue in the Vatican. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Etienne. Thank you very much, Rabbi David, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. Listening to that introduction, it suddenly struck me that it could sound very pompous to organize a conference where you become the main public speaker. And I should say it was David Rosen when we were, David Novak, when we were planning this, said, I'll speak if you speak, and we can do this together. So just that slight stepping back. No, me. The other thing I want to make is a confession, which was when I was a doctoral student at Cambridge, I used to sell a magazine on the streets in the city centre market square on Saturday, which supported the line that Israel was part of a colonial imperialist plot and that really they had no right to be there at all. 14 years ago, I started researching the Catholic Church's teaching on the Jewish people, and during that process, I've come to review that earlier view and that sense in which theology affects politics and politics affects theology. So I want to argue that Catholic theology has come to a crossroads, or one might say a cliff edge. At Vatican II, initial steps were made in Lumen Gentium 16, Nostra Aetate 4, which emphasized the covenant made by God with the Jewish people that is irrevocable. And this is what Paul says in Romans 11:29 about biblical Judaism. In 1980, the connection with biblical Judaism and contemporary rabbinic Judaism is made by then Pope John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, where he identifies modern rabbinic Jews as the inheritors of the Mosaic covenant. Therefore, if one wants to take Catholic doctrine seriously, I want to suggest that we've got to address the question, if part of the covenant with the Jewish people, and in fact such a central element, is the land, and Catholics repeat very often about the irrevocable gifts and promises, simple question, what does a Catholic say about the gift, which is the land? And that's what I want to address today. And before I leap into the topic, I should make it very clear, because of time constraints, I won't be able to address the question of the Palestinians, but I want to say it's fundamental to the approach I want to propose. And the Holy See has agreements with the Palestinian people in 2000 and a Palestinian state in 2015, and is committed to a just international resolution. So theology goes hand in hand with that particular point, and that's a sort of backcloth to all that I say. I should also say I hold what David Novak calls a soft supersessionist view, by which I mean that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, believed by Catholics, and the fulfillment of the promises made to Israel, but this does not eradicate the God-given status of the covenant with the Jewish people or the promises made to them. Aligning these two claims is the tightrope walk that modern Catholicism is having to undertake. I'm going to make my argument in 3 steps. The first step, and this is going to be terribly superficial, I do apologize, but I'm just trying to make a case. The first step will be addressing what Catholics call the Old Testament. The second will be addressing the New Testament. And the third will be addressing 1948 Israel, the contemporary question of how does this all fit with what's happening in history very recently. So the Old Testament is rich with different themes related to the land. 70% of references when covenant is mentioned are linked explicitly to the promise of the land. Amidst this complexity, there are 3 indisputable elements. The first is God's promise to the land, of the land to Abraham and his descendants. The Jewish people are not chosen because of the land. Key figures like Moses never enter the land. They're hardly less Jewish for it. The people exist first. The boundaries of the land are drawn very differently. Genesis 15 depicts the largest area. Smaller but varying boundaries are drawn in Deuteronomy, Numbers, Ezekiel, Exodus, and yet again differently in another part of Deuteronomy. Now, scholars dispute whether these are boundaries fixed by God in the narratives or territories related to historical context and existing political conditions to facilitate a home for the people. Regarding boundaries, I also want to just recall a fascinating story in Genesis 13, 5 to 13. A dispute arises between Lot and Abram over the land, and Abram offers Lot first choice of the land so that the dispute may be resolved. Lot chooses the finest portion, and Abram's content. Now, this theme occurs 36 times, connected with the stranger. And I do not want to equate Palestinians as strangers in recalling this. I simply want to indicate that there is an issue about land, boundaries, and territory, which are quite fluid. Second point, Israel's gift of the land from God also requires from his people a moral and cultic purity. The biblical narrative shows that the people consistently fall away from this high calling. Becoming the people was a process with a lot of messiness and no easy linear trajectory. And as Catholics, I think, one should certainly have sympathy with this, given that we are called to be a spotless spouse of the spotless Lamb. And you can see that we are still struggling with that. Third point, lest the unconditional gift and the process of becoming God's people become a cause for complacency, Leviticus 18:28 contains a stark and terrifying warning. If you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were there before you. This is a key verse for why Catholics could not see the modern return of the Jewish people as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy regarding the end times. That presumes to make a judgment that only God could make. Are we Catholics to say that this most significant gift is null and void, an unconditional gift, despite God's irrevocable promise? So, to dramatically move to the second section, does Jesus Christ void the promise? And we can turn to the New Testament. The church is never in the New Testament called the New Israel, that particular phrase. In the 80 usages of Israel, It usually refers to the Jewish people or their polity or to the land directly. And there are 4 New Testament themes I just want to indicate or highlight. The first is that Jesus is entirely committed to the land and the Jewish people. Surprise, surprise. He is Jewish. Jesus orients his ministry in relation to the land, both at the beginning and the end of his ministry. The birth narratives enact the people's exile in Egypt, followed by the Holy Family's return to the land from Egypt. During Jesus' ministry, he never leaves the land. He is only concerned with Israel, his people. Going to the ends of the earth is left to the church gathered around him after the resurrection. And this conforms to the expectations regarding the arrival of the Jewish Messiah, who will be a light to the nations. Jesus will make Israel, the people and the land, a light to the nations. Second theme. Many of Jesus' teachings focus on the land. Take, for instance, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," Matthew 5:5. Many biblical scholars argue it is better rendered, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land." Matthew was drawing on Psalm 37:11, and in that psalm, the Hebrew eretz refers to the land of Israel, not the world. 4 other verses in Psalm 37 repeat the phrase, "inherit the land," with the land of Israel as the clear referent. This would mean that his Jewish disciples would eventually inherit the land in the renewal of all things. And that raises an interesting question which I can't really explore further here. Third, after the resurrection in Acts 1:6, Jesus responds affirmatively to the question whether he has come to restore the kingdom to Israel. But he also warns the disciples that the exact timing of this event is not for you to know. It is the Father's initiative. Any Jewish listener, and all the disciples were Jewish in this narrative, would know this reference is to the land. Fourth, the focus on the land is not confined to Jesus alone. St. Paul cites the land gift in Acts 13:19 as part of his recalling God's mighty acts, culminating but not finishing in Jesus Christ. It is the same Paul who in Romans 11:29 says, "These gifts are irrevocable." For any Jewish reader, it would be clear that one of these gifts is the land. It is, after all, the secondary focus of the covenantal gift after the primary one, which is the creation of the people. But the New Testament is complex, and it reconfigures the Old in a messianic fashion. If the land promise is not consigned to what's been called replacement theology, the theology that's been officially criticized and rejected, meaning that the promises are invalid to Israel, if the land promise is not consigned to replacement theology, we must ask whether the restoration of the land to the people of Israel should be considered an eschatological sign of Jesus' return, part of the themes in the New Testament. It is difficult to deny that this could be the case. Only God knows. This is not an evasion. We cannot know the hour and must, as Jesus tells us, remain diligent concerning the signs. Finally, what of the New Testament references that seem to move away from the particularity of the land and to universalize the kingdom? I would want to argue that there is a universalizing tendency, which is important and part of the view that a special gift is taken to the Gentiles. This is to all nations. But the universal does not dematerialize or destroy the particular. Just as Jesus Christ is the scandal of particularity, so is the land and the Jewish people, both of which he is formed by. So my tentative conclusions, and they're super tentative because they've been made super quick, is that on the basis of the Old Testament and the New Testament, we are poised to now address the question, what happens with the appearance of Israel 1948 and following, and can Catholics give a theological as opposed to a legal and juridical response, which they have already done? In the phrase modern Israel, I wanted to note the Jewish people living upon the land, not the form of nation state or any particular political party that may run that state or its prudential judgments. Some form of governance is required for the safety and security of the Jewish people in the land, but I take the form of governance to be a contingent factor. The promise to the Jewish people is not a contingent factor. Second, I want to keep with the Catholic Church's affirmation of the 1947 UN boundaries in speaking about Israel from this point on. And third, the Palestinian claims regarding their homeland must be justly attended to, and this is central to any Catholic approach. So my sole question now is whether the biblical promises might relate to Israel 1948 onwards in the way I've defined. Again, a few considerations. First, if there is an ingathering of Jewish people to the land, which is certainly the case, this may be God's providential action. Popes since St. John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis have all viewed matters in this way, that there is a providential action of God in this formation of the Jewish people. I'll give you a single instance, but there are many more. In 1991, Pope John Paul's visit to Brasilia, where he cites Ezekiel 34:13, which is a very central text to both Jews and the reading of this text in understanding the restoration of the kingdom. He says, "May our Jewish brothers and sisters who have been led out from amongst the people and gathered from the foreign lands," quote from Ezekiel, "brought back," another quote, "to their own country, to the land of their ancestors, be able to live there in peace and security on the mountains of Israel, guarded by the protection of God, their true shepherd." End of quote. If that gathering of the Jewish people was the initiative of secular Zionists with the support of evangelical British Christians, it does not seem to matter. That the Pope interprets this ingathering biblically does matter. Second, could modern Israel be the beginning of the end days? Can this even be considered when so much darkness and tragedy surround the early days of Israel, where destruction and dispossession are also part of the story? Now, attention to Jesus' teaching requires modesty about confidently declaring this to be the case. Close attention to the biblical promises reinforces the reticence. The people may be vomited out, I pray they won't, but it has happened before. We cannot force God's hand or prematurely declare this is the fulfillment of Scripture. This may be a return, not the return. But the ingathering of the Jewish people and their preservation as a people is deeply biblical and cannot be ignored. Third point, and I've been reiterating this throughout, any consideration of this scenario in the way I've been proposing must pay attention from a Catholic viewpoint to justice and peace for the Palestinian people. Fourth point, Catholics are not in the habit of affirming nation states as God-given. Zionism has often been configured falsely as an underwriting of a nation state created by God. Some Christian Zionists, like Pat Robertson, in effect say, if you oppose Israel, you oppose God. This is problematically to conflate the people, the land, and the modern nation state as indivisible. And there are two serious objections to looking at it in this manner. The first is a historical, straightforward one, that Zionism, Jewish Zionism, has never had a single view of the nation state, constantly evolving, developing. Early Zionists envisaged the future Jewish state in Palestine as either binational or part of a larger multinational framework. This was true of Leon Pinsker, Chepotonsky, Herzl, Ahad, and David Ben-Gurion. After 1948, and certainly after 1967, the picture of Zionism goes through multiform transformations, and David has touched on that matter. So there is no question that there must be a form of governance for people in the land, but it does not mean that the God-given form is the current nation state. I want to finish then with a quote from Pope Benedict, who speaks, I think, with great insight on this matter. He writes, at its core about the Catholic Church, the conviction that a strictly theological understood state, a Jewish faith state, that would view itself as the theological and political fulfillment of the promises is unthinkable within history according to the Christian faith and contrary to the Christian understanding of the promises. What we have there is a clear marker that any move such as I'm proposing would have limitations and carefully qualified designations. It could not affirm the Jewish state in particular forms, but as Rabbi Rosen's presentation makes clear, there are very different forms in which Jews themselves construe the matter. I want to suggest, therefore, that we cannot evade the question before us, and that there are grounds to give a positive affirmation, qualified, limited, and with due sensitivity to the Palestinian people of this land being part of God's promise and providential care. Catholics, I want to end by saying, have only one real duty, besides to carry on as a people, but to attend to revelation, first and foremost. By not addressing the question of the land, the Catholic Church could be in danger of not being attentive to revelation. Its silence on this matter should not replicate previous silences regarding the Jewish people. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor Da Costa. Thank you, Gavin, for this very substantial presentation in a short time. You gave us a quick but very precise reading of the Christian Old Testament and of the New Testament, and a very careful reading of Catholic teaching. It's interesting to see how you are both faithful to Catholic teaching, but you try to coax from the text the maximum it can mean, and also possible developments. So it's a good step forward, or opening towards a good step forward.